The bathroom mirror reflected a map of violence that 7-year-old Mason Walker had learned to read like a weather forecast. Purple bruises bloomed across his narrow ribs like storm clouds. The fresh ones from 3 nights ago remained tender to touch, while older marks had faded to yellow-green reminders of Ray's previous rages. Mason traced a finger along the edge of a particularly dark bruise just below his left shoulder blade, wincing as the movement sent sharp pain through his torso. 6 weeks. It had been 6 weeks since Ray Wilson's violence had escalated from occasional slaps to systematic beatings that left Mason struggling to breathe. 6 weeks of learning to muffle his cries with his pillow, of perfecting the art of walking without favoring injured sides, of becoming an expert in the precise shade of concealer that Elaine left scattered across the bathroom counter. Mason reached for the small tube of foundation, its contents nearly depleted, from weeks of covering finger-shaped bruises on his arms and neck. The shade was too light for his skin, but it was better than the alternative questions he could not answer without putting Emma in danger. He dabbed the makeup carefully over a particularly visible mark on his collarbone, blending it with the practiced efficiency of someone far too young to possess such skills. Outside the window, Boston winter had wrapped the neighborhood in a thick white blanket. Snow gathered against the window pane, and the thermometer mounted outside read 12 degrees below zero. The world beyond their walls looked peaceful, pristine, and completely at odds with the reality inside. From the bedroom down the hall came the sound of Emma's morning babbling. Her 10-month-old voice created a soundtrack of innocence that stood in stark contrast to the reality of their home. Mason's chest tightened with the familiar weight of responsibility that had settled there 8 months ago, when Ray first walked through their front door all charm, and promises that had fooled everyone except Emma, who had cried inconsolably in his presence from the very beginning. The house had been different then. Quieter, yes, with just Mason and his mother Elaine managing their modest life in the small colonial house on Maple Street. Elaine had been sad since his father left when Mason was 4, but she had been present, attentive, protective. The accident at the textile factory changed everything. The injury to her back, the prescription painkillers that started as legitimate medicine and became her escape from a reality too painful to face. Ray had appeared during those dark months like a predator sensing vulnerability. He brought flowers and takeout dinners, paid attention to Elaine when she felt invisible, and presented himself as the solution to their financial struggles. Mason had watched from the stairs as this stranger gradually took over their lives. First with sweet words and small gifts, then with demands and expectations that grew heavier each week. The transformation had been gradual enough that Mason could not pinpoint exactly when protection became possession, when care became control. Ray's drinking increased as his gambling debts mounted. His patience with Mason's presence diminished as Elaine's dependency on medication deepened. The verbal criticism came first. Sharp words about Mason being too clingy with his mother, complaints about normal childhood behaviors, constant reminders that he was an unwelcome addition to Ray's vision of their family. The first time Ray struck him, Mason had been 6 years old and had accidentally spilled juice on Ray's betting slips. The slap across his face had been swift and shocking, followed immediately by Ray's menacing whisper. "Clumsy little accidents like that don't happen again, do they, boy?" Mason had nodded, cheeks stinging, and Ray had smiled. "Good. And we don't worry Mommy with stories about accidents, do we? She has enough problems without you making up tales." From that moment, Mason understood the rules of their new reality. Ray's violence was swift, strategic, and always accompanied by threats that centered on Emma's safety. "Keep crying, and I'll give that baby something to really cry about," had become Ray's favorite warning, delivered in the same tone another adult might use to discuss the weather. The threat was never idle. Ray's eyes, when he looked at Emma, held the same cold calculation Mason recognized in his own mirror, the assessment of vulnerability and the potential for causing pain. Mason finished his concealment routine and pulled on his school sweater, careful to keep the sleeves long enough to cover the finger-shaped bruises on his upper arms. The fabric felt rough against his tender skin, but he had learned to suppress the automatic flinch that might draw attention. Pain had become a constant companion, as familiar as his own shadow. He made his way to Emma's room where she sat in her crib, chubby hands wrapped around the rails as she pulled herself to standing. Her face lit up when she saw him, her entire body wiggling with excitement as she reached for him with the complete trust that only babies possessed. Mason's heart clenched with fierce protectiveness as he lifted her from the crib, noting how she immediately settled against his chest, her small fist curling into his sweater. "Morning, Emmy," he whispered against her soft brown hair, inhaling the sweet scent that was uniquely hers. Baby shampoo and the faint smell of the lavender lotion Elaine had used during her brief periods of maternal attention. "Did you sleep well?" Emma babbled a response, her sounds growing more complex each day as she approached her first birthday. Mason had been tracking her developmental milestones with the dedication of a pediatric nurse, reading library books about infant care when he should have been focusing on his own second-grade curriculum. He knew she was advanced for her age, pulling to stand at 9 months, saying "bah" with clear intent when she wanted her bottle showing preferences for specific toys and foods that indicated a strong developing personality. He changed her diaper with practiced efficiency, talking to her in the soft, steady voice that always calmed her fears. This morning routine had become sacred to him these few minutes when Emma's needs were simple and his ability to meet them was absolute. Here in the quiet of her nursery with morning light filtering through curtains, Elaine had hung during her last functional period. Mason could pretend they were a normal family preparing for a normal day. The illusion shattered as Ray's voice carried up from the kitchen, already slurred despite the early hour. "Where's my goddamn coffee, Elaine, Elaine?" The shouting was followed by the crash of something being thrown, a mug perhaps, or one of the ceramic ornaments that had been wedding gifts from Ray's relatives. Emma's face crumpled at the harsh sounds, her lower lip trembling in the way that always preceded tears. Mason quickly lifted her, bouncing gently as he'd learned to do, making soft shushing sounds that had become his most practiced skill. "Shemmy, it's all right. Mason's got you. Everything's all right." But everything was not all right, and they both knew it. Emma had developed an acute sensitivity to household tension, crying inconsolably when Ray's voice reached certain decibels, refusing to eat when the atmosphere grew too charged with unspoken violence. Mason had watched her personality shift over the months, the carefree baby laughter becoming rarer, her sleep more fitful, her need for physical comfort from him intensifying as she learned to associate other adults with danger. Mason carried Emma downstairs, each step measured and careful to avoid the creaks that might draw Ray's attention before he was ready. The kitchen was a disaster zone of the previous night's rage-broken crockery swept into a corner, alcohol stains on the counters, and the acrid smell of cigarettes smoked down to the filter. Ray sat at the small table, his back to them, shoulders hunched over what appeared to be racing forms from yesterday's newspaper. "You're late," Ray said without turning around, his voice carrying the particular edge that meant his hangover was severe and his mood correspondingly dangerous. "Baby should have been fed an hour ago." Mason said nothing, having learned that any response could be interpreted as defiance. Instead, he moved to the cupboard where Emma's formula was kept, balancing her on his hip as he prepared her morning bottle with the precision of a trained caregiver. The routine was calming for both of them, measuring the powder, testing the temperature on his wrist, finding Emma's favorite spot by the window, where morning light created patterns on the wall that fascinated her. "Look at that," Mason whispered, pointing to the dancing shadows created by the neighbor's tree. "The leaves are moving just for you, Emmy. They're saying good morning." Emma's attention fixed on the patterns, her small hand reaching toward the light as she drank her bottle. These moments of peace were precious because Mason never knew how long they would last. Ray's mood shifted like weather systems. Calm could become violent with the speed of a summer storm, and Mason had learned to read the atmospheric pressure of their household with survival-dependent accuracy. Ray's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, and Mason's body automatically tensed, every muscle prepared for impact, every nerve ending alert to the possibility of sudden movement. Ray moved to the sink, his movements deliberately loud as he banged dishes and muttered complaints about useless women and freeloading kids. "School," Ray said without looking at Mason. "And don't be filling that teacher's head with stories." Mason had learned that Ray's most dangerous moments often came wrapped in casual conversation, violence delivered with the mundane predictability of breakfast routines. Mason finished feeding Emma and handed her to Elaine, who had finally emerged from the bedroom in her bathrobe, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating the world through a pharmaceutical haze. Elaine's prescription routine had evolved over the 8 months of Ray's presence. Pain medication for her back injury, supplemented by anxiety tablets, sleeping pills, and antidepressants that left her functioning in a twilight state between consciousness and oblivion. Mommy needs to rest. Elaine murmured, her words slightly slurred as she accepted Emma with the mechanical motions of routine. Be good at school, love. There was love in her voice, genuine maternal affection that made Mason's chest ache with longing for the mother who had existed before Ray, before the accident, before the medications that had become her primary relationship. Sometimes in brief moments between pills, Elaine's eyes would clear and she would see her children with devastating clarity. Those moments were almost worse than her absence because they reminded Mason of what they had lost. Mason gathered his school bag, checking that his homework was complete, despite having worked on it by flashlight under his covers after the previous night's beating. His teacher, Mr. James Donovan, had begun to notice his declining performance, his frequent absences, and the way he sometimes winced when sitting down or raising his hand. Yesterday, he had kept Mason after class to ask if everything was all right at home. Fine, Mr. Donovan, he had answered with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that honesty was a luxury he could not afford. Everything's fine. But Mr. Donovan had looked at him with the sharp attention of an educator who had seen too many children carrying adult burdens. His questions were gentle but persistent, and Mason had felt the dangerous temptation to tell anyone about the reality of their lives. The moment had passed when the school secretary knocked to remind them about the buses, but Mason knew Mr. Donovan's attention had been awakened. The walk to Pine Brook Elementary School took 15 minutes through Boston's February cold, past rows of houses that looked identical to his own, but seemed to contain families who laughed over breakfast and said goodbye with hugs instead of threats. Mason had learned to observe these normal families with the detached interest of an anthropologist, studying their routines and interactions as if they belonged to a different species. He passed the corner store where Mr. Chen always smiled and asked about school, the bus stop where mothers waited with strollers and discussed their weekend plans, the small park where fathers pushed children on swings before work. These glimpses of ordinary life had become simultaneously comforting and painful reminders of what childhood was supposed to look like, what families could be when they functioned properly. The most difficult part of his walk was passing Boston Children's Hospital, its modern glass facade rising like a beacon of hope and safety that felt impossibly distant from his reality. Mason had studied that building during school trips, memorizing its location and wondering if the doctors there really could help anyone who walked through their doors. The hospital was exactly 6 blocks from his house, a distance he had measured during lonely afternoon walks, when Ray's drinking made home too dangerous and the streets felt safer than his own bedroom. At school, Mason slipped into his classroom with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that attention often brought pain. His desk was in the 3rd row, far enough from Mr. Donovan's direct line of sight to avoid constant scrutiny, but close enough to participate when called upon. He had perfected the art of academic camouflage, performing well enough to avoid concern about his intelligence, poorly enough to explain his occasional absences and lack of concentration. Good morning, Mason, Mr. Donovan said as he settled into his seat. His voice carried the particular warmth he reserved for students he worried about, and Mason felt the familiar spike of anxiety that came with adult attention. How are you feeling today? Fine, Mr. Donovan, he replied automatically, the same response he gave to all inquiries about his well-being. Thank you for asking. But Mr. Donovan's eyes lingered on him longer than usual, and Mason realized he had noticed something. Perhaps the way he had favored his left side while walking to his desk, or the careful way he lowered himself into his chair to avoid aggravating the bruises across his ribs. He forced himself to sit normally, ignoring the sharp pain that movement caused, and opened his mathematics workbook with hands that trembled slightly from the effort of appearing uninjured. The morning lessons passed in a blur of multiplication tables and reading comprehension activities that felt surreal when his mind was occupied with survival calculations. How long could he keep concealing the bruises? How much worse would Ray's violence become as his gambling debts increased? How could he protect Emma when he could barely protect himself? During morning break, Mason sat alone at the edge of the playground, watching other children play games that seemed to belong to a different world. His classmates had stopped inviting him to join their activities months ago, having learned that Mason's participation was unpredictable. Some days he played with desperate enthusiasm, as if storing up joy for lean times, while other days he sat in silent withdrawal, his body language discouraging any approach. Mason, Mr. Donovan had appeared beside him, his voice gentle but concerned. Would you mind helping me organize the classroom library during lunch? I could use an extra pair of hands. It was not really a request, and they both knew it. Mr. Donovan had been creating opportunities to spend time alone with him, his teacher's instincts clearly detecting something amiss, despite Mason's careful performance of normalcy. Mason nodded, knowing that refusal would only intensify his scrutiny. The afternoon brought more challenges as his body's pain competed with his need to maintain appearances. His ribs ached with every breath, and the bruises on his back made sitting upright an exercise in endurance. When Mr. Donovan called him to the whiteboard to solve a mathematics problem, Mason stood too quickly and immediately regretted the sharp pain that shot through his torso. "Are you all right?" Mr. Donovan asked, his attention now fully focused on Mason's obvious discomfort. "Just a bit stiff," Mason replied, forcing a smile that felt like a betrayal of everything he was experiencing. "I slept funny last night." The lie came easily because he had practiced variations of it dozens of times, but Mr. Donovan's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced. He allowed Mason to return to his seat without further questions, but Mason could feel him watching for the remainder of the afternoon, cataloging every wince, every careful movement, every sign that suggested his student was carrying burdens no 7-year-old should bear. The school day ended with Mason's usual mixture of relief and dread. Relief at having successfully maintained his facade for another 6 hours, dread at returning to a house where Ray's mood would have been fermenting in alcohol and resentment since morning. He walked home slowly, partly because his injuries made faster movement painful, and partly because he was reluctant to face whatever awaited him. The house felt different when he opened the front door, charged with a particular tension that made the air seem thick and dangerous. Ray was in the living room, surrounded by betting slips and empty beer cans, his attention fixed on horse racing results that clearly had not gone in his favor. The television volume was turned up too loud, and Ray's commentary on the races was becoming increasingly violent and profane. "Where have you been?" Ray demanded, without looking away from the television. "School ended an hour ago." "I helped Mr. Donovan with some books," Mason replied carefully, setting down his school bag and immediately moving toward the stairs where he could check on Emma. "Don't lie to me, boy." Ray's voice carried the particular edge that meant his mood was deteriorating rapidly. "Teachers don't keep kids after school unless there's a problem." "What did you tell him?" The question was loaded with threat, and Mason understood that his answer would determine the severity of whatever punishment Ray was already planning. He had learned that Ray's violence often followed a predictable pattern, building tension throughout the day, triggered by external frustrations like gambling losses, then focused on Mason as the most convenient target for release. "Nothing," Ray, Mason said, using the respectful tone that sometimes diffused dangerous situations. "He just needed help organizing books." "I didn't tell him anything." Ray finally turned to look at him, and Mason saw the familiar coldness in his eyes that preceded violence. Ray's face was flushed from alcohol and anger, his hands clenched into fists that had become all too familiar weapons. The living room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in to trap them together in this moment of inevitable confrontation. "You better not have," Ray said, standing with the deliberate movement of someone trying to appear more sober than they actually were. "Because if I hear that social services have been sniffing around because you couldn't keep your mouth shut, you'll regret the day you were born." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of previous violence and the promise of worse to come. Mason stood perfectly still, every instinct screaming at him to run, while his rational mind calculated the impossibility of escape. Ray was between him and the front door, and any attempt to reach Emma upstairs would only draw Ray's attention to her vulnerability. From upstairs came the sound of Emma beginning to cry, hungry, tired, or simply sensing the household tension that had become their constant atmosphere. The sound seemed to galvanize Ray, his attention shifting from Mason to the source of the noise with the predatory focus of someone seeking a new target for his rage. "That baby better shut up," Ray said, his voice dropping to the menacing whisper that was somehow more frightening than his shouting. "I'm not in the mood for crying tonight." Mason's blood turned to ice at the implication. Ray had never directly threatened Emma before, but the way he looked toward the stairs suggested that his usual boundaries were dissolving under the pressure of mounting debts and increasing desperation. The gambling losses that had fueled today's rage were apparently severe enough to push Ray into new territory of violence. "I'll go settle her." Mason said quickly, moving toward the stairs with careful speed. She's probably just hungry. No, Ray said, his hand shooting out to grab Mason's arm with bruising force. You'll stay right here. Let Elaine deal with her own damn child for once. But they both knew Elaine was beyond dealing with anything. The sound of her medication-induced sleep was audible even from downstairs, the deep, unnatural breathing of someone too heavily sedated to respond to a crying baby. Emma's wails were increasing in volume and desperation, and Mason felt his protective instincts warring with his survival instincts in a battle that was tearing him apart. Ray's grip on his arm tightened, fingers digging into bruises that were still tender from previous encounters. The pain was immediate and sharp, but Mason forced himself not to react, knowing that any sign of weakness would only encourage Ray's aggression. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his mind racing through possible scenarios and finding no good options. Emma's crying reached a pitch that seemed to vibrate through the walls, and Ray's face contorted with rage that was becoming uncontrollable, his free hand clenched into a fist. And Mason realized with crystal clarity that tonight would be different from all the previous nights. Tonight, Ray's violence would not be limited to him alone. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Emma was no longer safe simply by virtue of being too young to provoke Ray's anger. Ray's desperation had reached a level where any source of stress, any reminder of responsibility, any obstacle to his self-pity would become a target. The crying baby upstairs was no longer an innocent bystander, but a potential victim of violence that would destroy her before she ever had a chance to grow up. Mason looked into Ray's face and saw his own death reflected there, along with Emma's, not necessarily tonight, but soon. Ray's control was slipping, his boundaries dissolving, his capacity for violence expanding to encompass anyone who reminded him of his own failures. The house that had been their prison was about to become their grave. Please, Mason whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. Please don't hurt her. Ray's smile was cold and predatory, the expression of someone who had just discovered a new source of power. Then you better make sure she stops crying, he said, releasing Mason's arm with a shove that sent him stumbling toward the stairs. And you better make sure you give me a reason not to go up there myself. The ultimatum was clear, and Mason understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Ray was no longer content with using Emma as leverage for Mason's silence. He was prepared to harm her directly, to make her suffer for the simple crime of existing in his world. The protective barrier that had kept Emma safe through months of escalating violence had finally crumbled. Mason climbed the stairs toward Emma's increasingly desperate cries, his mind already working on calculations that no 7-year-old should have to make. How much money had he hidden in his bedroom? How far could he carry Emma through February streets? How long before Ray's patience ran out completely? As he reached Emma's room and lifted her from her crib, feeling her small body shake with exhaustion and fear, Mason made a decision that would change everything. Tonight, while Ray drank himself into unconsciousness and Elaine remained lost in her medicated haze, he would take Emma and walk the 6 blocks to Boston Children's Hospital. He would tell them the truth, no matter what happened to him afterward, because Emma deserved a chance to grow up, and that chance was not going to come from staying in this house any longer. The weight of that decision settled over him as he held his baby sister, feeling her gradually calm in his arms. Outside their window, the February afternoon was fading into evening, and Mason began counting the hours until Ray would be drunk enough to provide their window of escape. Tonight would be the longest night of their lives, but if he could find the courage to carry Emma through those hospital doors, it might also be their last night in hell. The evening hours crawled by with the agonizing slowness of water torture, each minute stretching into eternity as Mason waited for the household to settle into its nightly routine of dysfunction. Ray remained planted in his living room throne, surrounded by the debris of another day's gambling failures, his consumption of alcohol steady and purposeful as he worked toward the stupor that would eventually claim him. The television blared horse racing results from tracks across the country, each disappointing outcome adding another layer to Ray's mounting rage. Mason had managed to keep Emma calm through dinner, a meager affair of canned soup and stale bread that Ray had declared good enough for freeloaders. He fed Emma her pureed vegetables with infinite patience, making airplane noises and silly faces to coax smiles from her. Despite the tension that filled their small kitchen like poisonous gas, every spoonful she accepted felt like a small victory, fuel for the journey that lay ahead of them. Elaine had made a brief appearance during the meal, moving through the kitchen with the careful deliberation of someone navigating the world through a pharmaceutical fog. She had taken her evening dose of medication, a combination of painkillers, anti-anxiety tablets, and sleeping aids that Ray encouraged with the enthusiasm of someone who benefited from her absence. By 8 o'clock, she had retreated to their bedroom, her breathing already taking on the deep, unnatural rhythm that indicated complete unconsciousness until morning. "Bedtime," Ray announced without looking away from the television, his words slightly slurred but carrying absolute authority. "Both of you, I don't want to hear another sound until morning." The command was delivered with the casual brutality that had become Ray's signature, a reminder that their existence in his house was conditional on their invisibility. Mason nodded silently, lifting Emma from her high chair and carrying her toward the stairs. Her weight felt different tonight, not heavier, but more precious, as if he was carrying not just his baby sister, but their entire future. Mason's bedtime routine with Emma had become sacred to him, a series of rituals that provided structure and comfort in their chaotic world. He changed her into clean pajamas, soft cotton, decorated with tiny elephants that Elaine had bought during one of her brief periods of maternal engagement. He warmed her evening bottle to the precise temperature she preferred, testing it on his wrist with the expertise of someone who had become her primary caregiver by necessity rather than choice. As Emma drank her bottle, her eyelids growing heavy with approaching sleep, Mason studied her face with the intensity of someone memorizing a masterpiece. Her features were becoming more defined each day, Elaine's delicate nose, his own dark eyes, a determined chin that belonged entirely to herself. She was beautiful in the way that all babies were beautiful, but to Mason, she represented something more fundamental: hope, innocence, and the possibility that love could exist even in the darkest circumstances. "Tomorrow will be different, Emmy," he whispered against her soft hair, his voice barely audible in the dim nursery. "Tomorrow will be somewhere safe, somewhere people will help us." Emma's response was a contented sigh as she finished her bottle, her small body relaxing into the sleepy limpness that indicated complete trust in his care. Mason placed her in her crib with infinite gentleness, covering her with the hand-knitted blanket that had been a christening gift from Elaine's mother, a grandmother Emma would never meet because Ray had systematically isolated them from all extended family. But instead of leaving Emma to sleep, Mason settled into the nursing chair beside her crib, positioning himself where he could watch both her peaceful face and the door that led to the hallway. Tonight was different from all the previous nights charged with the electricity of impending change. Tonight, Ray's threats had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and Mason knew with crystalline certainty that tomorrow would find them either safe or dead. From downstairs came the sounds of Ray's escalating intoxication, the volume of the television increasing as his coordination decreased, the crash of bottles being knocked over, the muttered curses that grew more violent and incoherent with each passing hour. Mason had learned to read these audio cues like a meteorologist tracking storm systems, predicting the intensity and duration of Ray's rages based on the rhythm and frequency of his outbursts. 9 o'clock brought the sound of Ray stumbling to the kitchen, presumably in search of more alcohol. The refrigerator door slammed with unnecessary force, followed by the crash of something glass hitting the floor and Ray's creative string of profanity. Mason tensed at the violence in Ray's voice, even when directed at inanimate objects, knowing that such rage needed an outlet and fearing that Ray might decide to climb the stairs in search of more satisfying targets. But Ray's footsteps returned to the living room and the television volume increased again as he settled back into his chair. The horse racing had given way to late-night action movies, the kind of violent films that seemed to feed Ray's worst impulses. The sounds of explosions and gunfire filtered up through the floorboards, creating a soundtrack of aggression that made Emma stir restlessly in her sleep. 10 o'clock marked the beginning of Ray's truly dangerous period, drunk enough to be unpredictable, but not yet unconscious enough to be harmless. This was when his paranoia peaked, when shadows became enemies and innocent sounds became provocations. Mason had learned to become absolutely still during these hours, to breathe quietly and avoid any movement that might draw attention from the volatile man below. Tonight, however, Ray's attention seemed focused on the telephone. Mason could hear him making calls, his voice alternating between wheedling and threatening as he apparently tried to negotiate with creditors or arrange new lines of credit. The conversations were brief and seemed to end badly based on the violent way Ray slammed the receiver down after each attempt. "Bloody thieves," Ray's voice carried up the stairs loud enough to wake Emma if she had been a lighter sleeper. Think they can push me around? Think they can threaten me in my own home? The irony of Ray complaining about threats while terrorizing his own family was not lost on Mason, but he was more concerned with the escalating desperation in Ray's voice. Desperate men were dangerous men, and Ray's financial situation had clearly reached a crisis point that made him capable of anything. 11 o'clock brought a temporary lull as Ray's attention turned to what sounded like food preparation, the microwave beeping, drawers slamming as he searched for utensils. But the interlude was brief, and soon Ray was back in his chair, his commentary on the late-night programming becoming increasingly aggressive and nonsensical. By midnight, Ray's speech had deteriorated to the point where individual words were difficult to distinguish, but the tone remained consistently threatening. He seemed to be arguing with the television, responding to dialogue as if the characters could hear him, his voice rising to shouting levels that made Mason wince with each outburst. Emma had been sleeping peacefully for hours, her breathing steady and undisturbed despite the chaos below. Mason envied her ability to find peace in their hostile environment, but he also felt a fierce protectiveness at her vulnerability. She trusted him completely, had learned to associate his presence with safety and comfort, and that trust was both his greatest treasure and his heaviest burden. At midnight, Ray's voice took on a new quality, a slurred, rambling monologue that seemed to be directed at invisible listeners. He was talking about debts, about people who didn't understand the situation, about solutions that involved violence and revenge. The words were increasingly incoherent, but the underlying rage was unmistakable. Show them who they're dealing with, Ray muttered, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet house. Show them what happens when they push too far. The threat in his words made Mason's blood run cold, not because he feared for himself, but because he understood that Ray's desperation was pushing him toward a breaking point that would destroy everyone in his path. Emma would not be spared simply because she was innocent. In Ray's current state, innocence might actually make her a more attractive target. 1 o'clock brought the sound Mason had been waiting for, Ray's voice fading to mumbles, then silence punctuated only by the occasional snore. But Mason forced himself to wait longer, knowing that Ray sometimes experienced brief periods of wakefulness even in his deepest alcoholic stupors. The man was unpredictable even in unconsciousness, and Mason could not afford to make his move too early. At 1:15, Mason finally allowed himself to believe that Ray was truly unconscious. The snoring had become regular and deep, and the kind of alcohol-induced sleep that typically lasted until late morning. More importantly, there had been no response to the various small sounds Mason had deliberately made. The creak of the nursing chair, the soft rustle of moving fabric, the gentle sound of his breathing, moving with the careful precision of a burglar in his own home. Mason rose from the chair and began his preparations. He had been planning this moment for weeks, mentally rehearsing every step while lying awake during previous nights of violence and fear. The execution would require perfect timing, absolute silence, and more courage than any 7-year-old should need to possess. His first stop was his own bedroom, where he retrieved the small canvas bag he had hidden beneath his mattress. Inside were the supplies he had been gradually accumulating: loose change stolen penny by penny from Elaine's purse, a small box of crackers hoarded from school lunches, a miniature flashlight he had found in a kitchen drawer. The total amount of money was pitiful, perhaps $3 in various coins, but it might be enough for a bus fare if walking proved impossible. Emma's bag was hidden in her closet behind boxes of outgrown clothes that Elaine had saved for reasons she could no longer remember. This bag contained the essentials for infant care bottles, formula powder diapers, and a change of clothes in the next size up that Emma would soon need. Mason had assembled these supplies with the methodical care of someone preparing for a siege, knowing that Emma's needs were more urgent and complex than his own. The most critical element was warmth. February nights in Boston were brutally cold, and Emma's infant body would lose heat rapidly in the outdoor air. Mason selected her warmest sleep suit, a thick fleece outfit with attached mittens and booties that would provide maximum coverage. Over this went her winter coat, a puffy pink jacket that made her look like a tiny astronaut but would shield her from the wind. For himself, Mason chose layers: a thermal shirt beneath his heaviest sweater, his winter coat, and the wool hat that Elaine had knitted before her decline into medication dependency. He would be carrying Emma for the entire journey, and his own comfort was secondary to ensuring her safety and warmth. The most dangerous part of the preparation was gathering Emma from her crib without waking her. She was normally a sound sleeper, but the stress of recent weeks had made her more sensitive to disturbances. Mason approached her crib with the stealth of a master thief, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Emma stirred slightly as he lifted her small body instinctively curling against his chest as he transferred her to his shoulder. She made a soft sound of protest but did not wake her trust in his handling, absolute even in sleep. Mason held his breath until her breathing returned to its steady rhythm, then began the delicate process of dressing her for their journey. Getting Emma into her fleece sleep suit while she slept required patience and flexibility that Mason had developed through months of caring for her. He worked one arm at a time into the sleeves, supporting her head, while maneuvering the fabric over her torso, fastening the snaps with movements so gentle they barely disturbed her position. The winter coat was more challenging, but Emma remained blissfully unconscious throughout the process. With Emma properly dressed and secured against his chest, Mason made one final circuit of the nursery, gathering the last essential items. Her favorite comfort blanket, a soft yellow rectangle that had been with her since birth, went into the bag along with her preferred pacifier and a small stuffed elephant that helped her sleep. These items might seem trivial compared to food and shelter, but Mason understood that Emma's emotional needs were as important as her physical ones. The journey to the ground floor required navigating a minefield of potential noise hazards, creaking floorboards, squeaky hinges, and the general tendency of old houses to announce movement with various groans and sighs. Mason had mapped every sound-producing surface during his months of midnight wanderings, creating mental charts of safe pathways that would allow silent passage through the house. Each step was deliberate and measured, his weight distributed carefully to minimize sound. Emma remained asleep against his shoulder, her breathing warm against his neck, her complete trust in his care both inspiring and terrifying. If he failed tonight, if they were caught before reaching safety, Ray's revenge would be swift and final. The living room presented the greatest challenge as Ray was sprawled in his chair directly beside the path to the front door. His snoring was deep and regular, but Mason knew that even unconscious Ray retained some level of awareness that could be triggered by unexpected sounds or movements. The television was still playing its blue light flickering across Ray's slack features and creating moving shadows that made the room feel alive with threat. Mason pressed himself against the wall, moving inch by inch around the perimeter of the room, while keeping Ray in his peripheral vision. The man looked smaller in sleep, less intimidating, without his conscious cruelty animating his features, but Mason felt no sympathy for his tormentor. Ray had made his choices, had created this situation through his own violence and selfishness, and whatever consequences followed would be entirely of his own making. The front door was ancient and temperamental, prone to sticking and squeaking at the worst possible moments. Mason had practiced opening it silently during previous sleepless nights, learning the precise combination of movements that would allow it to swing open without protest. Tonight, his preparation paid off as the door opened smoothly and quietly, revealing the cold February night beyond. The temperature difference was immediate and shocking. The house had been warm with central heating, while the outdoor air carried the sharp bite of winter that immediately penetrated their clothing. Emma stirred at the sudden cold but did not wake, her face automatically nuzzling deeper into the warmth of Mason's neck as her body sought protection from the elements. Mason pulled the door closed behind them with infinite care, ensuring that the latch engaged without the clicking sound that might wake Ray. Only when he was certain the door was secure did he allow himself to breathe normally, his exhaled breath creating small clouds in the frigid air as he stood on the front step of what had been their prison. The street was empty and silent, illuminated by sporadic streetlights that created pools of orange light separated by deep shadows. Most of the houses showed no signs of life, windows. Dark curtains drawn families sleeping peacefully in beds where children did not fear the adults who were supposed to protect them. Mason felt a momentary stab of envy for those normal families, but quickly pushed the emotion aside in favor of focusing on the task ahead. Emma's weight was already noticeable, and they had not yet left their front yard. 10 months of growth had made her a substantial burden for someone of Mason's size, and he knew that carrying her 6 blocks through winter streets would test the limits of his endurance. But the alternative, leaving her with Ray, was unthinkable, and Mason had learned that desperation could provide strength that logic said should not exist. The first block passed without incident. Mason's steps careful and measured as he adjusted to Emma's weight and the challenge of maintaining balance on pavement that showed patches of ice from the day's brief snow flurries. His breath came in invisible puffs, and he could feel the cold beginning to penetrate his layers of clothing, but Emma remained warm and sleeping against his chest. By the second block, Mason's arms were beginning to ache from Emma's weight, and he was forced to stop for his first rest. He found a low wall outside a corner shop, settling carefully with Emma still in his arms, her face protected from the cold air by the collar of his coat. The brief respite allowed him to readjust his grip and redistribute her weight, but it also gave him time to fully appreciate the magnitude of what he was attempting. 6 blocks had seemed manageable when measured during daylight walks with no burden to carry, but now the distance felt enormous. Emma was growing heavier with each step. His own injuries from Ray's previous beatings were making movement painful, and the cold was affecting his coordination and strength. Doubt crept into his mind like poison, whispering that he was too small, too weak, too young to save them both. But then Emma made a soft sound in her sleep, her small hand curling into his sweater with unconscious trust, and Mason's resolve crystallized into something unbreakable. She was depending on him completely, had no one else in the world who would protect her, and he would carry her to safety even if it killed him. The alternative, returning to Ray's house and waiting for the inevitable escalation of violence, was simply not acceptable. The third block brought new challenges as Mason's legs began to tremble from exertion and his breathing became labored. Emma's weight seemed to increase with each step, and he was forced to stop twice more for brief rests that barely restored his strength before it was depleted again. The hospital was still 3 blocks away, but already felt impossibly distant. A car passed during his third rest stop, its headlights briefly illuminating their position on a bench outside a closed pharmacy. Mason instinctively pressed deeper into the shadows, terrified that someone might stop to ask questions about a child carrying a baby through the streets in the middle of the night. But the car continued without slowing its driver, presumably seeing nothing unusual in the darkened doorway. The fourth block nearly broke his resolve as Emma began to stir her sleep, disturbed by the cold and the unfamiliar sensation of prolonged movement. She made soft sounds of distress that Mason feared might escalate to crying, and he found himself talking to her in the soft, reassuring voice that had become his most effective tool for maintaining her calm. "Almost there, Emmy," he whispered against her ear, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Just a little bit further, and then we'll be somewhere warm and safe. Mason's got you, sweetheart. Everything's going to be all right." Emma settled at the sound of his voice, her trust in him absolute, even in her semi-conscious state. Her small body relaxed against his chest, and Mason felt a surge of protective love, so fierce it nearly brought tears to his eyes. She was his responsibility, his greatest treasure, and the most important thing he would ever do in his life was getting her to safety. As he continued his journey, the snow began to fall more heavily, large flakes swirling in the streetlights and quickly accumulating on the sidewalks. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally and finding every gap in Mason's clothing, sending shivers through his already exhausted body. His fingers and toes had gone numb, but he welcomed the numbness as a respite from pain, knowing that the real danger would come if the numbness spread to his limbs and made carrying Emma impossible. The fifth block was a test of pure willpower, as Mason's body began to rebel against the prolonged exertion. His arms felt like they were on fire, his legs shook with each step, and his breathing came in short gasps that created larger clouds in the frigid air. But Boston Children's Hospital was finally visible in the distance, its modern facade and brightly lit emergency entrance calling to them like a beacon of hope. Emma was stirring more frequently now, her internal clock telling her that something was wrong with their routine. She made small sounds of confusion and discomfort that Mason soothed with constant murmurs of reassurance, but he could feel her approaching wakefulness and knew that time was running out before she would begin crying in earnest. His pace increased despite his exhaustion, a final desperate push towards safety before Emma fully woke, and their journey became exponentially more difficult. The sixth and final block stretched before them like an eternity, but Mason forced his legs to continue moving, his mind focused entirely on the promise of safety that lay ahead. Each step brought them closer to help, closer to adults who were trained to protect children, closer to a world where Emma could grow up without fear. The snow was falling so heavily now that it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, the world reduced to a swirling white veil that seemed determined to erase their path to safety. Mason's feet slipped on the icy sidewalk, and he nearly fell, managing to keep his balance only by grabbing a nearby fence post, the movement jostling Emma, who began to whimper in protest. "Look, Emmy," Mason whispered as they approached the hospital's automatic doors, his voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "We made it. We're going to be safe now." As if in response to his words, Emma chose that moment to fully wake, her eyes opening wide as she took in their unfamiliar surroundings. For a heartbeat, Mason feared she would begin crying, but instead she stared in fascination at the swirling snow and the bright lights of the hospital ahead, then turned to him with a gaze so filled with trust that it nearly broke him. He had carried not just her physical weight, but also the weight of her future, and now, just yards from safety, he felt both burdens and the honor they represented. The final steps to the hospital entrance seemed both endless and instantaneous, a strange duality of time that Mason would later struggle to describe. His legs were moving on autopilot, no longer responding to conscious commands, but continuing through some deeper survival instinct that refused to allow failure when they were so close to their goal. Emma was now fully awake, her head swiveling to take in the strange environment, but she remained quiet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The automatic doors slid open as they approached, and suddenly they were inside, surrounded by warmth and light, and the antiseptic smell of a place where healing happened. Mason's legs nearly gave out as relief flooded through him, but he managed to remain standing, Emma still secure in his arms, both of them finally somewhere that represented hope instead of horror. The emergency department was quiet at this hour, with only a few staff members visible behind the reception desk. But as Mason stood there, a small boy carrying his baby sister and swaying from exhaustion, he caught the attention of a nurse whose trained eye immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. She was walking toward them now, her face showing the kind of professional concern that Mason had dreamed about during the longest nights of their ordeal. Help was finally coming, and Emma would never have to fear Ray Wilson again. The automatic doors of Boston Children's Hospital closed behind Mason, with a soft whoosh sealing out the February cold and enveloping them in an atmosphere of warmth and antiseptic cleanliness that felt like stepping into another world. The emergency department was bathed in the kind of bright clinical lighting that made everything appear sharp and real, a stark contrast to the shadowy nightmare they had just escaped. Mason stood in the entrance, swaying slightly from exhaustion, Emma still in his arms despite the dramatic change in environment. The waiting area was nearly empty at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, with only a handful of people scattered across the rows of blue plastic chairs, an elderly man holding a blood-stained cloth to his hand, a young woman rocking a feverish toddler, a teenager with what appeared to be a sports injury. Their eyes turned toward Mason with the idle curiosity of people passing time in uncomfortable circumstances, but their attention quickly returned to their own problems when nothing obviously dramatic presented itself. Mason's legs felt like they might give out at any moment, the adrenaline that had sustained him through their journey beginning to ebb and leave behind a bone-deep weariness that threatened to overwhelm him. Emma's weight, which he had carried for 6 blocks through winter streets, now felt impossible to support for even another minute, but he forced himself to remain standing, knowing that appearing in control was crucial to ensuring they received the help they needed. The reception desk was staffed by a single nurse, a woman with kind eyes who was processing paperwork with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to working night shifts. She looked up as Mason approached her, professional smile faltering slightly as she took in the sight of a small boy carrying an infant in the middle of the night. "Hello there," she said, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. "I'm Diana Rodriguez. Are you here with someone? Where are your parents?" The questions were standard, logical, and completely impossible for Mason to answer honestly without revealing the entirety of their situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that his voice had abandoned him somewhere during their desperate journey. The words that had seemed so clear in his mind, the explanation he had rehearsed during sleepless nights, suddenly felt inadequate to convey the complexity of what had brought them here. "We need help," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, my sister, she's not hurt, but we can't go home." Diana's expression shifted from routine concern to sharp attention as her training kicked in. She had worked in pediatric emergency medicine long enough to recognize the signs of a serious situation, even when they presented in unexpected forms. A 7-year-old boy carrying an infant through hospital doors in the early hours of the morning was not a scenario that occurred without significant underlying trauma. Of course, sweetheart, she said, reaching for her telephone. Let me get one of our doctors to come and talk with you. Can you tell me your name? Mason, he replied, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the genuine desire to help in her tone. Mason Walker, and this is Emma. She's my sister. All right, Mason, I'm going to call Dr. Winters to come and see you. He's very nice and he's excellent with children. Can you sit down for me? You look exhausted. But Mason remained standing, his protective instincts unwilling to let him relax even in this safe environment. Emma was fully awake now, her internal schedule disrupted by their unusual journey, and he could sense her growing confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings. When she woke in new places, she would often become frightened, and he needed to be alert enough to comfort her. Within moments, a doctor appeared from the treatment area, moving with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to responding to urgent situations. Dr. Michael Winters was in his late 50s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the particular combination of warmth and authority that came from decades of pediatric practice. He had seen enough in his career to recognize crisis when it walked through their doors, and everything about this situation triggered his professional instincts. Hello, Mason, he said, his voice pitched at exactly the right level, calm enough to be reassuring, warm enough to encourage trust, but serious enough to convey that he understood this was not a routine visit. I'm Dr. Winters, but you can call me Michael. I hear you and Emma need some help tonight. Mason looked up at him, his dark eyes holding far too much knowledge for someone his age, and Dr. Winters felt his heart clench with recognition. He had seen that expression before, the premature wisdom that came from experiencing adult horrors while still possessing a child's vulnerability. Whatever had brought this boy and his baby sister to their emergency department in the middle of the night, it was serious enough to warrant his complete attention. Yes, Mason replied simply. But Dr. Winters noticed how he instinctively adjusted his position to keep Emma's body shielded from view, how his eyes constantly scanned the area around them, how his entire posture suggested someone prepared to defend against attack. These were not the behaviors of a child who had experienced a simple family emergency. Let's go somewhere more comfortable where we can talk, doctor. Winters suggested, gesturing toward a private consultation room that was specifically designed for sensitive conversations. It's warmer there, and Emma will be more comfortable when she wakes up fully. Mason hesitated, his survival instincts warring with his desperate need for help. The past 8 months had taught him to be wary of adults who offered assistance. But something in Dr. Winters' manner, the way he spoke to Mason as an equal, rather than a small child, the genuine concern in his eyes, the fact that he had immediately recognized Emma's needs, made him want to trust the doctor. Will you call the police? He asked the question, revealing both his fear and his understanding that their situation was serious enough to involve law enforcement. Dr. Winters' training had prepared him for this moment, the point where a child in crisis revealed their awareness that authority figures would need to be involved. His response would determine whether Mason continued to trust him with the truth or retreated into the protective silence that many abused children used as their final defense. Mason, he said, crouching down to bring himself to the boy's eye level without crowding him, my job is to make sure you and Emma are safe and healthy. If someone has hurt you, then yes, we might need to involve other people who can help protect you. But right now, my only concern is taking care of both of you. Can you trust me to do that? The honesty in his response, the acknowledgement that help might involve consequences that could feel frightening, actually increased Mason's confidence in his reliability. Adults who made promises they couldn't keep had proven dangerous in his experience. But Dr. Winters was being truthful about the complexity of their situation. Okay, he said quietly, following the doctor toward the consultation room with steps that were careful but no longer fearful. The room was designed to be as non-threatening as possible, warm lighting instead of harsh fluorescence, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle rather than clinical examination tables, colorful artwork on the walls that depicted cheerful scenes of children playing. But what mattered most to Mason was that it had a door that could be closed, providing privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Dr. Winters helped him settle into one of the chairs, noting how he continued to hold Emma, despite the obvious strain on his small frame. The baby was beginning to stir more actively now, her sleep disturbed by the unfamiliar voices and environment, but she seemed content to remain in Mason's arms rather than reaching for the adult stranger. She trusts you completely. Dr. Winters observed, recognizing the significance of Emma's behavior. Babies who had been well cared for showed this kind of secure attachment, but babies who had experienced trauma often exhibited different patterns of bonding. Emma's calm acceptance of Mason's care suggested that despite whatever had brought them here, she had been receiving consistent loving attention from her brother. "I take care of her," Mason replied matter-of-factly, as if this arrangement was entirely normal. "I feed her and change her and make sure she's safe. She knows I won't let anything bad happen to her." The simple statement carried enormous weight, revealing layers of responsibility and maturity that no 7-year-old should have been forced to develop. Dr. Winters made mental notes about the family dynamics that would have created the situation, but kept his expression neutral and supportive. "You're obviously very good at taking care of her," Dr. Winters said, allowing genuine admiration to color his voice. "She's lucky to have such a caring big brother. But Mason, taking care of a baby is a big job for someone your age. You shouldn't have to do it all by yourself." Emma chose that moment to fully wake up, her eyes opening to take in the unfamiliar surroundings with the alert curiosity of a healthy 10-month-old. She looked around the room with interest rather than fear, but her gaze consistently returned to Mason's face, seeking reassurance that everything was all right. When he smiled at her and spoke in the soft, gentle voice that had become their private language, she relaxed completely. "Hello, Emmy," Mason murmured, his voice taking on the tender quality that Dr. Winters recognized as genuine parental love. "We're somewhere safe now. This is Dr. Winters, and he's going to help us." Emma's response was a babbled sound that might have been an attempt at communication, accompanied by the kind of smile that lit up her entire face. She was clearly a thriving, well-loved child despite whatever circumstances had brought them to the hospital, and Dr. Winters felt his respect for Mason increase as he witnessed the quality of care he had been providing. "She's beautiful," Dr. Winters said, sincerely noting Emma's bright eyes, healthy complexion, and the obvious signs of good nutrition and hygiene that indicated consistent caregiving. "How old is she?" 10 months. Mason replied, his voice holding the pride of someone who had watched every milestone of her development. "She'll be 1 in April. She can pull herself up to standing, and she says ba when she wants her bottle. She likes music and bright colors, and she always smiles when she sees me in the morning." The detailed knowledge of Emma's development and preferences confirmed Dr. Winters' assessment that Mason had indeed been functioning as her primary caregiver. This level of intimate familiarity with an infant's needs and personality came only from constant, attentive care over extended periods. Whatever their home situation, Mason had been doing the work of a parent while still being a child himself. "Mason," Dr. Winters said gently, recognizing that the moment had come for the crucial questions. "Can you tell me what happened tonight? What brought you and Emma to the hospital?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of truth that was about to be revealed. Mason looked down at Emma, who had begun to fuss slightly as hunger and confusion about their changed routine started to affect her mood. He bounced her gently in the way that always soothed her, his mind clearly working through how to explain the inexplicable. "Ray hits me when Mom's sleeping," he said finally. His voice steady but quiet, as if saying the words too loudly might somehow make Ray appear in their safe room. "He was going to hurt Emma tonight. I couldn't let him hurt her. She's just a baby." The simple, devastating statement contained multitudes months of abuse endured in silence, a child's desperate decision to protect his infant sister, a journey through winter streets that could have killed them both. Dr. Winters felt his professional composure waver for a moment as the full implications of Mason's words settled over him like a physical weight. "Ray is your stepfather?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest at the thought of someone harming these children. "He married Mom when Emma was 2 months old." Mason explained, his matter-of-fact tone making the abuse sound almost routine. "At first he was nice, but then he started getting angry about things. He drinks a lot and he gambles, and when he loses money he gets really mad. Mom takes medicine that makes her sleep, so she doesn't know what happens." Each detail added another layer to the picture of systematic abuse and neglect that Dr. Winters was assembling in his mind: an alcoholic gambling stepfather with impulse control problems, a mother rendered absent by substance abuse, a 7-year-old boy forced to become a parent to his infant sister while absorbing violence meant to control and intimidate. "How long has Ray been hitting you?" he asked, already knowing that the answer would be measured in months rather than days. Since before Christmas, Mason replied unconsciously, touching his ribs, where the most recent bruises were hidden beneath his layers of clothing. It got worse after New Year's. He said I was making too much noise, that I was costing him money, that Mom would be better off without me around to cause problems. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical abuse, Dr. Winters realized. Ray had been systematically destroying Mason's sense of self-worth while using Emma as leverage to ensure his silence. The boy had been carrying not just the responsibility for Emma's care, but also the weight of believing that he was somehow responsible for the violence inflicted upon him. Mason, listened to me very carefully, Dr. Winters said, leaning forward to ensure eye contact while keeping his voice gentle but firm. None of this is your fault. Ray hitting you is wrong, and it's against the law. You didn't deserve it, and you couldn't have prevented it by being different or better or quieter. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. Emma had begun to cry softly, her hunger and confusion finally overcoming her usual calm temperament. Mason immediately shifted into caregiver mode, reaching into the bag he had brought to retrieve a bottle and the container of formula powder. His movements were practiced and efficient, but Dr. Winters noticed how he winced when reaching above his head, suggesting injuries to his torso that were hidden by his clothing. "Let me help you with that, dear girl," Winters offered, recognizing that Mason's injuries were likely making even simple movements painful. "I can warm the bottle while you hold Emma." "I can do it," Mason replied automatically, the response of someone who had learned that accepting help often came with strings attached. But then he seemed to reconsider, looking at Dr. Winters' face and seeing only genuine desire to assist. "But if you want to help, that would be nice. She likes her bottles warm, but not too hot." The small concession felt like a victory to Dr. Winters, a sign that Mason was beginning to trust that help could be offered without hidden agendas or dangerous consequences. He took the bottle and formula powder, noting the quality of the supplies, good brand. Formula clean bottles, everything a responsible caregiver would choose for an infant's nutrition. "You've been taking very good care of her," Dr. Winters observed as he prepared Emma's bottle using the water warmer that was standard equipment in all their consultation rooms. "She's clearly healthy and well-nourished. That's not easy to accomplish when you're only 7 years old yourself." "She needs me," Mason replied simply, as if this explanation covered everything. "Nobody else makes sure she gets what she needs. Ray doesn't like it when she cries, and Mom isn't really there anymore, so I have to take care of her." The bottle was ready, and Dr. Winters handed it back to Mason, watching as Emma immediately latched on and began drinking with the enthusiasm of a hungry baby who trusted completely in her caregiver's ability to meet her needs. The sight was both heartwarming and heartbreaking, a testament to the love between siblings and an indictment of the adults who had failed them both. Mason, Dr. Winters said quietly, knowing that his next actions would irrevocably change their lives, "I need to call some people who can help make sure you and Emma are safe. That means doctors will need to check that you're both healthy, and police officers will need to ask questions about what Ray has been doing. It might feel scary, but these are all people whose job is to protect children." Mason's grip on Emma tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady when he responded. "Will they take Emma away from me?" The question revealed his deepest fear, not that he would be separated from his abusive home, but that he would be separated from the sister who had become his entire world. Winters understood that Mason's identity was completely wrapped up in his role as Emma's protector, and that any plan for their safety would need to account for their bond. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay together." Dr. Winters promised, meaning every word. "You've shown that you can take excellent care of Emma, and separating siblings is something we try very hard to avoid. But right now, I need to focus on making sure you're both safe and healthy. Can you trust me to do that?" Mason studied his face for a long moment, his young mind making calculations about trust and risk that no child should have needed to master. But something in Dr. Winters' expression, perhaps the genuine respect he showed for Mason's relationship with Emma, or the way he spoke to him as someone whose opinions mattered, convinced him to take the leap of faith that would change everything. "Okay," he said quietly, "but I need to stay with Emma. She gets scared when I'm not there and she doesn't know you yet." "Of course," Dr. Winters agreed, already reaching for the phone that would begin the process of protecting them both. "Emma can stay with you while we get everything sorted out." You're her big brother, and that's not going to change. As Dr. Winters began making the calls that would bring police officers and social workers into their lives, Mason continued, feeding Emma his voice soft and reassuring as he talked her through this strange new environment. It's going to be different now, Emmy, he whispered against her soft hair. But different might be better. Different might mean safe. Emma's response was a contented sigh as she finished her bottle, her small body relaxing against Mason's chest in complete trust. Whatever came next, whatever questions would be asked and decisions would be made, she was safe in the arms of the brother who had carried her 6 blocks through a winter night to give her a chance at the childhood she deserved. The truth was finally in the light, and there would be no going back to the darkness they had left behind. The automatic doors of Boston Children's Hospital closed behind Mason with a soft whoosh, the sound marking an invisible boundary between the nightmare they had escaped and the sanctuary they had entered. The sudden transition from bitter cold to warm air caused his frozen skin to tingle painfully. Snow melted from his coat and shoes, forming small puddles on the polished hospital floor. Detective William Blackwell arrived within 30 minutes of Dr. Winters' call, his heavy boots leaving wet imprints as he strode through the emergency department. 20 years in family crimes had taught him that cases involving young victims required both urgency and delicacy. His broad shoulders and salt and pepper hair gave him an imposing presence, but the gentleness in his eyes spoke of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the vulnerable. "You must be Mason," he said, kneeling down to meet the boy at eye level. The detective's voice was deep but soft like distant thunder without the threat of storm. "I'm Detective Blackwell, but friends call me Will. Dr. Winters tells me you've had quite a journey tonight." Mason nodded cautiously, his arms still protectively wrapped around Emma. She had fallen asleep again, exhausted from their ordeal, her cheeks flushed pink from the dramatic temperature change. "The doctors need to check both of you," Detective Blackwell explained. "The cold can hurt your body in ways you might not feel right away. Would it be okay if they do that while we talk?" Mason hesitated, his grip on Emma tightening slightly. "She can stay right where we can see her," the detective added, nodding toward a pediatric examination bed where Dr. Winters and a nurse were preparing. "I promise." The medical examination revealed what the detective had feared. Mason's fingers and toes showed early signs of frostbite, white patches on his skin where blood flow had been restricted by the intense cold. His core temperature was dangerously low at 95 degrees, placing him in moderate hypothermia. Emma, though better protected and warmed by Mason's body heat, still showed signs of mild hypothermia. "We need to warm them gradually," Dr. Winters instructed the nursing staff. Thermal blankets, warm IV fluids for Mason, and continuous monitoring for both. As the medical team worked, Detective Blackwell began the delicate process of gathering Mason's story. The boy's account was remarkably coherent despite his physical condition. He described Ray's escalating violence, his mother's absence into medication, and his desperate decision to flee when Ray's threats extended to Emma. "He said if I told anyone he would hurt Emma." Mason explained, his voice steady, though his body trembled under the warming blankets. "He said nobody would believe me because I'm just a kid. But last night was different. I saw it in his eyes. He was going to hurt her for real." Each revelation built the case against Ray Wilson. Psychological manipulation, isolation tactics, threats against an infant, systematic physical abuse. Detective Blackwell had seen many abusers in his career, but the calculated nature of Ray's cruelty toward a 7-year-old boy struck him as particularly vicious. "You're a very brave young man, Mason," the detective said, meaning every word. "What you did tonight, carrying your sister through that storm, that's something most adults wouldn't have the courage to do." Mason looked down at his bandaged hands, embarrassed by the praise. "I just did what I had to do," he said simply. "She's my sister." While Mason's statement was being recorded, a second team of officers had been dispatched to the Walker Wilson home. They found Ray exactly as Mason had described, unconscious in his chair, surrounded by empty bottles and betting slips. The living room television still blared, casting blue shadows across his slack face. The officers noted the disarray of the home, the broken dishes in the kitchen, the medicine bottles in Elaine Walker's bedroom, all corroborating Mason's account. Ray Wilson's arrest was remarkably anticlimactic. He woke disoriented and confused, initially mistaking the police for debt collectors. It was only when the officers read him his rights and the charges, multiple counts of child abuse, criminal endangerment, and making criminal threats, that comprehension dawned in his bloodshot eyes. "This is bullshit," he slurred, struggling as they handcuffed him. Those kids are fine. Ask Elaine, ask her. But Elaine Walker was barely coherent when officers found her the combination of prescription medications rendering her incapable of understanding the situation. As the fog of sedation began to lift in the back of a police cruiser on the way to the station for questioning, her first words were a plaintive, "Where are my babies?" The officer driving exchanged a glance with his partner. How could a mother not know her children had fled in the middle of a February night? By dawn, social worker Jennifer Barnes had completed her initial assessment and was searching her database for emergency placement options. The case required caregivers experienced with trauma, willing to take siblings, and available immediately. The Mitchell family appeared at the top of her list. Robert and Catherine Mitchell had been foster parents for 12 years, specializing in emergency placements and siblings. Robert, a former high school English teacher, had left his 30-year career to focus on fostering full-time. Catherine worked part-time as a pediatric nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, her professional experience making her uniquely qualified to care for children with complex needs. Their modest colonial home in Brookline had hosted 27 children over the years, each room thoughtfully designed to provide both comfort and security. The boy carried his sister 6 blocks in the blizzard, Jennifer explained during her early morning phone call. They'll need special care, particularly the older one. He's been functioning as the baby's primary caregiver. We'll be ready, Catherine promised. How soon can you bring them? By mid-morning, Mason's medical treatment was complete. The frostbite on his extremities had been minor enough to treat without surgical intervention, though several of his toes would likely lose sensation temporarily. The hypothermia had responded well to treatment, his body temperature now stable at 98.6 degrees. Emma had fared better, her core temperature normalizing quickly, showing no lasting effects from their journey. What concerned the medical team more were Mason's older injuries, the pattern of bruising across his torso and back, the finger-shaped marks on his upper arms, the evidence of previously fractured ribs that had healed without medical attention. The contrast between these injuries and Emma's perfect physical health told its own story about Mason's priorities and his determination to protect his sister at any cost. The Mitchells arrived at the hospital just before noon, carrying a small duffel bag of children's clothes and a teddy bear. Their introduction to Mason was handled with the care that traumatized children required: no sudden movements, no expectations of immediate trust, no pressure to separate from Emma. "Hello, Mason," Catherine said, her voice warm but not overwhelming. "I'm Catherine, and this is Robert. We heard you and Emma might need somewhere to stay for a while." Mason studied them with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating adult intentions. "I take care of Emma," he said, his voice carrying a certainty beyond his years. "She needs me for everything. I know what she likes and what she's afraid of." Robert nodded seriously. "That makes sense. You know her better than anyone. We'd like to help you take care of her if that's okay. Our house has a nice room with a crib for Emma and a bed right next to it for you, so you can always be close to her." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as Mason asked detailed questions about their home, their routines, their understanding of Emma's needs. His interrogation was remarkably thorough. Did they know that Emma needed her bottle warmed to a specific temperature? That she had a yellow blanket she couldn't sleep without? That she was afraid of loud noises because of Ray's shouting? Catherine answered each question with patient honesty, while Robert took notes in a small notebook. "We want to get it right," he explained to Mason. "You're the expert on Emma, and we respect that." By early afternoon, the paperwork was complete, and Mason and Emma were cleared for discharge into the Mitchells' temporary custody. The hospital provided car seats and additional medical supplies, while Detective Blackwell promised to stay in regular contact as the case progressed. "You did the right thing, Mason," the detective said as they prepared to leave. "Now it's our turn to do the right thing for you and Emma." The drive to Brookline took 20 minutes, the Mitchells' sedan carefully navigating streets, still being cleared of the previous night's snow. Mason sat tensely in the back seat beside Emma's car seat, his eyes constantly moving between his sister and the unfamiliar neighborhood passing outside the window. The city looked different in daylight, the harsh edges of his nighttime journey softened by winter sunshine, glinting off snow-covered trees and rooftops. The Mitchells' home was a 2-story colonial with dark green shutters and a red front door. A stone pathway, freshly shoveled and salted, led from the driveway to a covered porch where ceramic pots waited for spring planting. Inside, warm air carried the scent of something baking chocolate chip cookies. Mason realized a smell so normal and comforting that it momentarily disoriented him. "We thought you might be hungry," Catherine explained, noticing his expression. But first, let's show you and Emma where you'll be staying. The children's room was on the second floor, a spacious bedroom painted in soft blue with white trim. A wooden crib with a new mattress stood against one wall, a twin bed with a colorful quilt against the other. Between them was a comfortable rocking chair and a small bookcase filled with children's books. Sunlight streamed through windows overlooking a backyard where Mason could see a swing set partially covered in snow. "We can change anything you don't like," Robert said, placing the duffel bag on the bed. "We want this to be your space." Mason walked slowly around the room, touching the furniture with cautious fingers, examining the crib with the critical eye of someone who understood infant safety. Emma, awake now and curious, reached toward the mobile hanging above the crib, small fabric birds that spun gently in the warm air from the heating vent. "She likes birds," Mason said softly. "How did you know?" Catherine smiled. "Lucky guess. Is it okay if I hold her while you look around more?" The question, asking permission rather than assuming authority, caught Mason off guard. Adults in his experience simply took what they wanted. He nodded hesitantly, watching closely as Catherine gently received Emma from his arms. His sister went willingly, already captivated by Catherine's necklace, a simple silver pendant that caught the light. "She seems to be feeling better," Catherine observed, her professional eye noting Emma's good color and clear eyes. "She's quite advanced for 10 months, isn't she? The way she tracks movement and reaches for things with such precision." Pride flickered across Mason's face. "She started pulling up to stand at 9 months. The book said that's early. She says ba when she wants her bottle and she knows her name. She's smart." The afternoon unfolded in a series of small, careful steps as Mason and Emma settled into temporary normalcy. Catherine prepared bottles according to Mason's exact specifications. Robert set up a play area in the living room with age-appropriate toys for Emma, and Mason supervised everything with the vigilance of someone unaccustomed to sharing responsibility. By evening, exhaustion had caught up with both children. Emma became fussy, overtired from the disruption to her routine and the strange surroundings. Mason, despite his own fatigue, insisted on handling her bedtime ritual himself. "She needs things to be the same," he explained as he prepared her for sleep. "She gets scared in new places." The Mitchells watched from the doorway as Mason went through an elaborate sequence of comfort measures, rocking Emma in the chair, singing a soft made-up song, placing her in the crib, with precise movements designed not to startle her. When she finally drifted to sleep, Mason remained beside the crib, his hand through the bars, maintaining contact with his sister. "You should sleep too," Catherine suggested gently. "It's been a very long day." Mason shook his head. "I have to watch her in case she wakes up scared." Robert considered this, then offered a solution. "What if we move the rocking chair right next to the crib? That way you could be comfortable but still be the first thing she sees if she wakes up." The compromise was acceptable, and Mason allowed himself to be settled in the chair with a blanket. The Mitchells left a small nightlight burning and the door slightly ajar, respecting his need for vigilance, while creating conditions that might allow him to rest. "He won't sleep in the bed tonight," Robert murmured as they descended the stairs. "Maybe not for many nights," Catherine nodded. "He's been her protector for so long. That doesn't change in a day." Downstairs, they received the first update from Detective Blackwell. Ray Wilson was being held without bail, charged with multiple felonies. The evidence collected from the house, combined with Mason's statement and the medical documentation, had created an airtight case. Elaine Walker had been admitted to a medical detoxification program, the first step in a court-mandated rehabilitation process. The temporary custody order would be reviewed in 30 days, with a more permanent decision to follow based on Elaine's progress. "The boy's testimony will be crucial," the detective explained, "but we'll do everything possible to make that process trauma-informed. He's been through enough already." As predicted, Mason didn't sleep in the bed that first night. The Mitchells found him the next morning still in the rocking chair, his body curled uncomfortably, but his hands still reaching through the crib slats to maintain contact with Emma. This pattern continued for nearly 2 weeks, Mason refusing to relinquish his vigilance, despite the Mitchells' gentle encouragement to rest. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during Mason's third session with Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist assigned to his case. Her office was designed to make children feel comfortable. Soft furniture, art supplies, toys carefully selected to facilitate expression rather than just play. Mason had been reserved during their previous meetings, answering questions politely, but volunteering little. "I notice you're very tired," Dr. Chen observed, offering him a choice of snacks from a colorful tray. Is it hard to sleep at the Mitchell's house? Mason selected a graham cracker, breaking it methodically into small pieces. I have to watch Emma, he explained as if this were self-evident, in case something happens. What do you think might happen? Dr. Chen asked. Mason was silent for a long moment, arranging the cracker pieces in a precise line. Ray might find us, he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Or Emma might need me and I wouldn't hear her. Or, he stopped, struggling to articulate the nameless fears that kept him vigilant. Or she might disappear, Dr. Chen suggested gently, and you would be alone. Mason's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise at her accuracy. It makes sense that you're afraid, she continued. For a long time, Emma has been the one person who needed you, who made you feel important. Protecting her gave you a purpose when everything else felt scary and out of control. Tears filled Mason's eyes, the first he had allowed himself since their escape. I'm the only one who knows how to take care of her, right? He said, his voice breaking. If I sleep, I might miss something important. Dr. Chen moved closer, offering a tissue but not touching him without permission. That's a very heavy responsibility for someone your age, she said. You've been carrying it for a long time, haven't you? The conversation that followed marked the beginning of Mason's understanding that safety might actually be possible, that adults could sometimes be trusted, that his identity did not have to be solely defined by his role as Emma's protector. It would take many more sessions, many more breakthroughs, but that afternoon marked the first crack in the armor he had built around himself and his sister. That night, for the first time, Mason slept in the bed. The winter weeks unfolded into early spring each day, bringing small but significant changes. Mason began attending a new school where his teacher, Mrs. Anderson, had been briefed on his situation and knew to watch for signs of anxiety or dissociation. To everyone's surprise, Mason thrived in the classroom, his natural intelligence emerging now that survival was no longer his primary concern. He devoured books well beyond his grade level, showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics, and gradually began interacting with classmates during recess. Emma, freed from the atmosphere of tension and fear that had characterized her early months, blossomed with astonishing speed. She took her first independent steps just before her first birthday in April, toddling across the Mitchell's living room carpet while Mason cheered her on. Her vocabulary expanded rapidly, May for Mason being her first clear word, followed by Cat for Catherine, and a delighted Bob that made Robert's eyes shine with unexpected tears. The legal proceedings moved forward with careful attention to the children's well-being. District Attorney Sarah Chen, known for her success with cases involving vulnerable victims, built a methodical case against Ray Wilson. The evidence was overwhelming. Mason's detailed testimony, recorded via closed-circuit television, the medical documentation of his injuries, the condition of the home, and Ray's own incriminating statements during jail phone calls to Elaine. Ray's defense attorney, recognizing the hopelessness of his client's position, attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution remained firm. The case went to trial in early May, with Mason's testimony serving as the centerpiece of the state's case. The boy's clear factual account of months of systematic abuse, delivered with a composure that belied his age, left the courtroom in stunned silence. When asked why he had finally decided to flee that February night, Mason's answer was both simple and devastating. He was going to hurt Emma. She never did anything wrong. She's just a baby. I couldn't let him hurt her because he was mad about losing money. So I took her somewhere safe where people would help us. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Ray Wilson was sentenced to 8 years in prison with additional probation terms that would prevent him from contacting either child upon his eventual release. Elaine Walker's journey toward recovery proved more complex and uncertain. The court-mandated detoxification and rehabilitation had forced her to confront not just her prescription drug dependency, but also the ways in which her absence had enabled Ray's abuse. Supervised visits with the children began 6 weeks after their removal, conducted in the neutral setting of the Family Services Center. Mason's reaction to seeing his mother again revealed the complicated nature of their relationship. Love and longing mingled with disappointment and wariness. During their second visit, he asked the question that had been haunting him: why didn't you see what Ray was doing to us? Why didn't you protect us? Elaine's response was painfully honest. I was sick, Mason, she said, tears streaming down her face. The medicine made me so sick I couldn't see what was happening right in front of me. I failed you, and I'm so sorry. The acknowledgement of her failure without excuses or deflection marked the beginning of a tentative rebuilding. Elaine enrolled in parenting classes, continued her addiction treatment, and secured part-time employment as her health improved. She understood that regaining custody would be a long process measured in consistent actions rather than promises. But for the first time in years, she had something concrete to work toward. As spring advanced, the Mitchells began discussing the possibility of becoming the children's long-term foster placement. The original emergency arrangement had been extended twice, and both Mason and Emma had formed strong attachments to the couple. The question of permanent custody would ultimately depend on Elaine's progress, but the stability of the current arrangement was benefiting everyone involved. The most visible evidence of Mason's healing came one warm May afternoon 3 months after their escape. Robert had been working in the backyard preparing the garden for planting when he noticed Mason watching him intently from the porch steps. "Would you like to help?" Robert offered, holding out a small trowel. "These tomato seedlings need to go in the ground today." To his surprise, Mason nodded eagerly and joined him in the garden. As they worked side by side in the soft earth, Robert realized it was the first truly childlike activity Mason had willingly engaged in. No responsibility, no purpose beyond the simple pleasure of digging in dirt and creating something new. "I've never planted anything before," Mason admitted, carefully patting soil around a fragile seedling. "Will they really grow into big plants with tomatoes?" "They will," Robert promised. "It takes time and care, but by August we'll have more tomatoes than we know what to do with." Mason considered this with the seriousness he applied to all new information. "Like people," he said finally, "they need time and care to grow right too." Robert blinked rapidly, turning away to hide the sudden moisture in his eyes. "That's exactly right, Mason. That's exactly right." Inside the house, Catherine was preparing lunch while supervising Emma, who had discovered the joy of stacking and toppling blocks. The toddler's delighted giggles filled the kitchen each time her tower collapsed, a sound so purely happy that it seemed to wash away the shadows of the past. The transformation in both children over these 3 months was remarkable to everyone who witnessed it. Mason still had moments of hypervigilance, still positioned himself between Emma, and perceived threats still woke occasionally from nightmares that left him shaking and disoriented. But he was also learning to play, to laugh, to accept help, to trust that safety was not merely a temporary illusion. Emma, with the remarkable resilience of very young children, had no conscious memory of the fear that had characterized her early months. Her development was accelerating, her personality emerging as bright and determined, her trust extending beyond Mason to include the adults who now populated her world. She still reached for her brother when uncertain or tired, still responded to his voice with special attention, but she was forming healthy attachments to others as well. That evening, as Mason helped Catherine prepare Emma's bath, a small incident highlighted how far they had come. Emma, excited by the bubbles Catherine had added to the water, splashed with such enthusiasm that water soaked the front of Mason's shirt. 3 months earlier, such an occurrence would have triggered immediate anxiety, a reflexive fear of punishment for mess or noise. Instead, Mason laughed, a genuine, spontaneous sound that seemed to surprise even him. "She's crazy about bubbles," he said, his eyes bright with amusement rather than worry. "She's going to get us all wet." "That's what towels are for," Catherine replied, matching his lightness. "And I think we can find a dry shirt for you somewhere in this house." Later, after Emma was asleep, Mason sat on his bed looking through a picture book Robert had brought home, a story about a boy and his dog having adventures in the woods. The simple act of reading for pleasure, of losing himself in someone else's story, rather than focusing on survival, felt like a luxury he was only beginning to understand was his right as a child. When Robert appeared in the doorway to remind him about bedtime, Mason looked up with an expression of wonder. "Do you think we could get a mock someday, Bud?" he asked. "I've always wanted one, but Ray said they were too much trouble." It was the first time Mason had expressed a personal desire, a wish for something that had nothing to do with Emma's needs or his own survival. The question contained multitudes' hope for a future belief that wishes could sometimes be granted trust, that adults might consider his wants important. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Robert said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What kind of dog would you like?" As Mason launched into an enthusiastic description of his ideal pet, Robert felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with being entrusted with this child's healing. There would be challenges ahead, court hearings, decisions about permanent custody, the complex process of helping Mason reclaim his childhood while honoring the strength that had allowed him to save his sister. But in this moment, listening to a 7-year-old boy dream of dogs and adventures rather than worry about danger and protection, Robert knew they were on the right path. In the crib across the room, Emma slept peacefully, one arm wrapped around the small stuffed elephant that had accompanied them on their journey through the February night. Outside the window, spring leaves rustled in a gentle breeze, the sound so different from winter's howling wind. Inside this room, two children who had survived the unthinkable were finding their way toward what all children deserve: safety care and the freedom to simply be young. Mason's journey from protector to protected, from premature adulthood back to childhood, was far from complete. There would be setbacks, difficult days when trust felt impossible, and security seemed like an illusion. But tonight, as he drifted towards sleep with thoughts of Dean and adventures rather than escape routes and dangers, the healing had truly begun. In that quiet moment between wakefulness and dreams, Mason realized something both simple and profound. For the first time since he could remember, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all.